Our superheroine figures are now ready to enter the design phase of comic book character production. This stage is all about figuring out what our characters are actually going to look like. I've zoomed in 25% here to work on the facial features of the first character. I sketch in the eyes and eyebrows, then move down the face to the nose and mouth, keeping in mind the iconic feminine characteristics for each. Her eyes should be framed by bold lashes that draw attention, her lips full and voluptuous. The nose is kept small and defined only at the tip and opening of the nostril. In general, the face will be kept absent of detail to give it a youthful appearance and in turn increase its femininity. After I've attended to the face, I zoom back out to view the entire character. As I define the various aspects of her design, I want to see how it's coming together as a whole. This helps ensure its integrity, that each element ties in seamlessly with the next. The last thing we want is a slapstick design that doesn't quite jive together as well as it could. In the Layers panel to the bottom right of the screen, I've turned off the Pose Draft layer to get a clearer look at the Anatomy Draft, which I've now changed to blue by pressing the Layer Color button. Above the Anatomy Draft layer, I've created a new one called Design Draft. As you might have guessed, every aspect of the design will be drawn in on this layer, and by keeping each step of the process separate, we're able to build our character in a non-destructive manner, meaning that if we mess up the design, we can always go back to the previous anatomy stage and rework it from that point, rather than restarting the entire drawing from scratch. As in the previous lesson, I'm using the pencil tool to draft up the character's design. To get a sharp, fine line, I've decreased the size of the brush, holding my stylus steady and carefully controlling the amount of pressure I'm applying as I draw. In Manga Studio, the pencil tool works very much like a regular pencil. The harder you press, the darker the line will be. The line work isn't ultra polished here, but it's still clean enough to show us a clear representation of the concept. At this stage, my focus is on defining the main contours of the character's design. You can see how I'm outlining each key section, such as the shape of her chest armor and shoulder pads, and now the leg with some subtle indication of the major muscle groups that'll be present in the final drawing. I'll continue defining each section until her entire design is completely outlined. Then, and only then, will I begin thinking about the rendering and details. I like to view the overall production of a line drawing as having three main phases of development: the rough draft, the defined outline, then the final polish, consisting of all the crisp details and rendering. Building up the drawing in this way makes it more manageable and straightforward. You're able to make more progress on it as a whole rather than completing bits and pieces of it haphazardly. Without that workflow, I tend to lose my way and the final outcome becomes much less predictable. Besides the armored chest piece, a majority of her outfit is made of a rubbery latex material that follows the forms of her body rather closely. This is where the muscle structure we overlaid on top of her pose previously in the last lesson is going to help me capture the correct shapes we need to describe her figure accurately. To help indicate the darker areas of the costume down the front of her torso, I'm placing in some shadows around her abdomen and pelvis, which I quickly decide to backtrack on, realizing it's probably a bad idea to skip ahead. It's so tempting to jump forward before the main outline is done sometimes, but doing this can really mess up your workflow and cause you to lose track of where you're at with the drawing overall. The muscle groups I've suggested around her legs, particularly the quads above the knee, lend to the tight appearance of her costume, but also shows that underneath it her body is built and toned. The tight-fitting one-piece suit is a popular costume choice for many heroines starring in superhero comic books, which, at first glance, might be assumed only really serves the shallow purpose of accentuating their figure and those sexy curves. And to be fair, it obviously does, and why not when you've got a rockin' physique to show off? But for a superheroine, wearing a costume made of flexible, durable, tight-fitting material also serves a very functional purpose. When you think about the capabilities of the typical superheroine, there's a good chance she might be able to fly and even possess super speed and strength as well, so she's going to require a costume that allows her to move freely with minimal drag, making the most of her enhanced agility and allowing her to use her superhuman abilities unhindered. Spandex-type bodysuits made of rubbery materials or even light Kevlar that are able to hug tightly against the body cater for all of that by being ultra aerodynamic and elastized enough to allow the character unconstrained movements regardless of their complexity or speed at which they're executed. The look of the spandex-clad superhero seems fairly stereotypical to comic books until you realize where its origins are derived from in the real world: circus acrobats and strongmen to allow for greater mobility when performing their stunts and grand feats. In fact, you can see this same correlation in the sportswear of high-level athletes today, whom are probably about the closest real-life comparisons we've got to superheroes and heroines. High-speed runners, competitive bodybuilders, combat sports like fighting and wrestling, ice skaters, dancers, and ballerinas all wear tight-fitting clothing, sometimes only around the key areas, that allow them to make the most of their physical capabilities without their outfits holding them back. As a competitive athlete, this might mean the difference between winning or losing against the competition. In the case of our superheroines, it could be the difference between life or death in a high-stakes battle. The choice of costume you decide on for your superheroine should ultimately reflect the special abilities they possess and who they are as a character. The heroine I'm working on here, for example, wears a tight-fitting costume because her special quirks include the ability to fly and move with lightning-fast speed, which is indeed why I've decided to give her the name Zing. At this stage, I'm focused on the secondary costume elements that add interest to the design and help pull it together. For the most part, they consist of the slightly elevated rectangular shapes I've placed in along the joints of Zing's suit, which you can also see popping up again around the knee pads. I've put a thin line out from the end of each costume connector, as I've decided to fondly refer to them as, creating a series of divisions that'll help describe the surface forms of the character. You can see how the two seams running parallel to one another around the top of her upper leg encircle its cylindrical form, giving us a visual indication of its dimensions. The same can be said about the rings around her wrist. I'm doing this intentionally because I know that once this character is in motion, these cross contours will help convey the foreshortening of her body as it's posed in perspective. You can see that I'm now revisiting the front midsection of Zing's body to outline the shadows around the bottom of her ribcage and abdomen. The reason I'm adding thick black shadows to this particular region of the design is because I want to introduce contrast to her costume by splitting it up into lighter and darker sections. Going off my initial preliminary concept for Zing, the front of her midsection, lower torso, inner thighs, neck, mask and biceps will be covered in black leather material. As a general rule of thumb, the darker the material is, the more shadow and rendering it'll require to lower its value. On the flip side of that, when it comes to lightly coloured materials, keep all details extremely minimal and shadows even more so. To lay in the shadows accurately, you'll need to place them according to the light source you've chosen to put your character under. In my case, the light source is projecting down onto Zing from the top left. With that in mind, I interpret the area I'm about to shade as very basic geometry and place shadows around the planes of the form that are facing away from the light. Something I personally find helpful is outlining the shadow first before filling in the blacks. This allows me to define them with a nice shape to begin with, but also makes it easier for me to discern what areas of the anatomy are going to be cast in shadow. How you go about cutting your character's costume up into contrasting tones is completely up to you, but try to have them lend to the readability of its design. The value scheme should either be a majority dark, minimal light, or a majority light and minimal dark to create hotspots of contrast throughout the figure. Think about how you can lead the eye around the design by playing the various values off of one another. For instance, Zing's face will ultimately be surrounded by the much darker tones of her hair, mask, and neck, pulling in the attention of the viewer instantly like a white dot on a black canvas. As I mentioned before, Zing can fly super fast, as her name would imply, so to suggest that, I'm going to add these robotic wings to her back. When airborne, I imagined them being able to lift up from this rested position and spread to reveal high-powered rocket boosters attached to a jetpack. They would act like the wings of a fighter jet that operate synergistically with her motor functions, so she can make quick turns in the air and perform complex maneuvers when fighting the bad guys. I'm trying to make her look insect-like, like a dangerous one that leaves a nasty sting, such as a wasp or hornet. In a way, you could say I've taken the iconic idea of a cape, commonly associated with superheroines, and recontextualized it in the form of these separated bug wings. The shape, angle and length of the wings are adjusted until I'm happy with how they're sitting. They're significantly modifying the silhouette of the character, so I want to make sure that they're fanning out to frame her body in a pleasing way that makes sense visually. If I can pull this off right, the wings combined with the hoops and shoulder pads should create a very recognizable silhouette for Xing. Moving on to the hair, I've grouped it into larger clumps that follow the general direction of its overall style. As her hair transitions from light to dark, it's divided into smaller and smaller sections that are given increasingly thicker shadows until they're completely blacked out. Just as before with her costume, the more shadow that's applied here, the darker her hair will appear. The texture gradient blending the light and dark values together should describe its layering and direction of flow by having the shadows follow the same trajectory. This ensures that her hairstyle reads clearly and helps it to avoid becoming a tangled mess. I've zoomed back in to begin working on the face of our next character, again starting with her eyes, then moving down to the nose and lips. The features are then framed by the outline of her face as I define the jawline, making sure to keep the corners soft and the chin narrow. Right off the bat you'll notice that her face looks very similar to Xing's, and the reason for that is because I'm using a stock standard head model. See, the more I stray away from the idealized representation of the head's shape, proportions and facial features, the greater the chance she'll begin to lose her physical appeal and attractiveness, because, of course, the opposite of ideal is flawed imperfection. This may result in a generic-looking face for your character, but that's not actually a bad thing. As a protagonist, you want your superheroines to be as easy to relate with as possible, and the more uniquely specific you make their anatomical features, the harder this becomes. A character who doesn't look like anyone in particular can pass for anyone, including you or I. No, the ideal is not real, existing only in the imagination, and while it resides in the fantasy realm of our minds as something desirable and perfect, we're able to envision ourselves as the hero inside the story, because it's just a fantasy. If you make them too real, reflecting the raw version of a person in an ordinary world, that character simply becomes someone else, another stranger we might see walking down the street or on the bus. So how do we make one superheroine look distinctly different from the next? Well, their idealized anatomical features may share similar proportions, but there's a lot of room for variety when it comes to the style, color, and composition of their costuming and hairdo, and that's really what makes a superheroine appear visually unique. Following the original preliminary design for the character, I've decided to give her a cape. I defined the sides with a light outline, then think about how the material might bunch up around the base. The cape hangs freely off her back, forming a series of pipe folds down its length, similar to a curtain, but there is still some gesture to it, and in that way, material is similar to hair. It has a certain amount of flow and direction of movement, and the vertical contours I'm laying in to define the folds indicate that. Loose-fitting materials and drapery abide to their own physics, but they are still dynamic in nature. The form cloth takes on can change dramatically depending on the object it's covering, how tight, loose or thick it is, and the environmental conditions it's placed under. So sometimes you have to experiment to see what looks best. If you place in a fold or crease and it doesn't quite look right, just erase it and adjust the flow of the material as needed. Now I'm drawing in an armoured corset, which will sit directly underneath her breasts to accentuate the bust and extend down over the midsection of her body. Armour is typically made of impenetrable, non-malleable materials such as metal and iron, so its design must be thought out carefully to make sure the character still has a full range of movement when wearing it. So this particular piece will be made of interlocking chrome plates that allow for free twisting and bending motion. You can see that as I make the divisions in the armor, I'm using her anatomy to help shape the plates. This ensures that as she moves, the armor will conform to her body correctly. I've used the idea of a corset to associate a certain level of sexual confidence to this character, but its very shape also enhances her feminine allure by accentuating the hourglass outline of her body. Combining that with the chrome material of the armor pushes the idea of her being a beautiful but divinely powerful goddess. As I faintly sketch in her lengthy loincloth, I'm again thinking about the fabric's flow of movement, which is a significant consideration here due to its non-conforming free-flowing structure. Rather than wrapping around the body, it hangs freely from the bottom of her armor, so its form will be greatly determined by the momentum and directional pull of the body's movement, as well as environmental elements such as wind. Moving up to the chest, I'm covering her breasts in the same material, except this time it is conforming to her body. The direction of the fabric folds and where they radiate from are determined by 2 points of tension found at the top of the shoulder and around the bottom of the breasts, where the fabric tucks into the armor. As the material stretches between these 2 points, the folds and creases smooth out over the surface of the breasts. This is why having a good understanding of female anatomy makes drawing the clothes of your superheroines much easier, because even if they're going to be completely covered from head to toe, the folds, creases, and points of tension will be greatly determined by the naked body underneath. And as it moves, the way the material pulls across its forms becomes an even more complex calculation that, to get right, means you gotta know what's going on behind the curtains. Now I'm tackling her leg armor, which is essentially made of a skin-tight chrome material similar to the armored corset we placed in around her waist. Because of how closely it's hugging her leg, I know most of the armor's design will be confined to the silhouette established by the leg's anatomy, and won't change its shape a whole lot. I'm addressing the pieces of armor covering the joints first, because I know they'll need to be designed in a way that enables the legs to move. So I'm overlapping a set of hinged chrome plates above the knees, which will extend over the joints when the leg is bent, and are able to retract back as it straightens out. My major aim in doing this is to suggest that the leg armor can indeed function correctly. If I want to suspend disbelief, then it has to make sense, to an extent. Because here's the thing, you only have to allude to the idea that it could actually work in reality. Because it's not how real you make your character appear that leaves a lasting impact, it's how cool, badass, and awesome they look in the end that really matters. Functionality and mind-blowing visuals should work in harmony, together, rather than being swapped out for one or the other. And the general rule I like to follow is that your design can be as out of this world as you like. It might be completely ridiculous, unrealistic, and totally out there, but it must still be plausible enough to convince the audience that your character could exist. So with the functional aspects of her armor mostly taken care of at this point, I'm getting a little more creative with the armored plating that's covering the rest of her leg. As with the previous character, I'm searching for a recognizable recurring pattern here that implies a running theme throughout the costume design. This consistency of complementary shapes and patterns form a harmonious visual language that makes the costume feel like it was crafted with purpose and careful thought, rather than being a combination of random design decisions that make no sense. That doesn't mean that everything has to be identical to fit in, but rather that each element should contrast well in terms of size, shape, and material. Usually, I try to stick to 2 or 3 recognizable components for the design. As an example, this character primarily consists of the chrome armor, loose fabric, and exposed areas of skin. You could also add to that her long golden locks of hair, but my point is that you want to try to keep the primary ingredients of your design limited, because the more you add in, the more diluted your idea will become. So, in short, keep it simple and stick to the few design elements that are working best for your character. As I move on to the arms, I'm going to replicate the same curved contours in their armor that I used for the legs. These patterns flow fluidly throughout the armor's design to create elegant shapes, both soft and clean cut. This makes her feel majestic and really pushes the fantasy theme I'm trying to go for here. It's the kind of armor a supreme goddess might wear when battling beings far more powerful than we could ever comprehend. Its material should seem otherworldly, as if the armor is made of an impenetrable intergalactic metal from another dimension. Nonetheless, the muscle structure of her arms still serve as a dependable guide for the composition of the chrome plating, giving the impression that although they're completely coated in metal from the upper arm down, they can still move freely. Even the most unique and inventive designs need to have some grounding in reality, and that's what makes them appealing. If you can achieve a never-before-seen design that seems unreal but still looks possible and feels familiar, then you've created an instant classic. You could say that the armor I'm designing here is rather removed from reality. In fact, it'd be easy to pick it apart and point out all the exposed areas of flesh that would certainly leave her open to a fatal blow. And it would be true. Many aspects of this design have been decided upon based on my personal preference for aesthetics over practicality, at least in this instance, because that's what I personally like to see in a superheroine. And your personal preference is really something that should be put before anything else as a creator, at least in my opinion. Otherwise, you'll become a slave to the preferences of other people who will never be 100% satisfied with what you do. There will always be someone out there ready to tear the validity of your character to shreds, especially if they belong to an inherently unrealistic genre such as superhero comic books. Why? Because you can't know or predict exactly what other people want to see. We all have our own individual tastes, ideas, beliefs, and opinions, and if all you do is design characters based on what you believe others deem as worthy, you're really creating their character, not your own. I'm making a few last-minute tweaks to the character here who, after some thought, I've decided to call Gardena, kinda trying to imply that she's the almighty guardian of her home planet in a faraway galaxy. Mostly, I'm fine-tuning the shapes of her anatomy and outfit, erasing, moving, and refining any areas that I think could do with a little more work. Following the general direction of her already established hairstyle, I'm also laying in some very fine lines to help break it up and to better describe its flow and texture. Finally, we're moving on to the last superheroine, and as you probably guessed, I'm going to go straight to work on her facial features. This time we're looking at a direct 3/4 view of the character's head, so I'll use the center line of her face to maintain its symmetry as I draw in the eyes and mouth. The features themselves will be slightly foreshortened by the angled perspective, but their proportional relationships to one another will still apply here. On the far side of the head, I'm going to run an outline around the cheeks and drop it straight down to the chin, where, from there, I'll follow it up into the jawline, keeping the corners soft and chin narrow to sculpt out a feminine shape for the face. Then I'm going to rough out the character's general hairstyle. Basically, she's going to be a cybernetically enhanced law enforcer of some kind, so I want her hair to really add to the context of the cyberpunk theme I'm trying to go for here. So I've made it short, sharp, and messy, the kind of hairstyle you'd see a real badass rebel rockin'. Once I've finished attending to the face, I'm going to zoom back out to view her entire figure. Seeing that her proportions are slightly off, I use the lasso and transform tool to scale up the size of her head. I'm never shy about making these adjustments, especially in the early stages when you're talking about the proportions or the pose of a character. It's way better to make those fixes now than to ignore them and keep going. It's like working with clay. The further you take the drawing, the more cemented it becomes, along with any foundational flaws you might have missed. Moving on to the costume, I've partially outlined her jacket and I'm trying to determine how it's going to sit around her waist. The cut of the jacket is interesting because it does hug the chest and shoulders closely, but loosens up around the base, causing the folding patterns of the material to change in different areas. So my main challenge is figuring out how to compose the folds and creases between these transitions, and how the tension points will direct the pull of the material across the character's body. The collar of the jacket is folded up around the back of her neck to create the cool mysteriousness commonly associated with PIs and detectives. Besides looking stylish, having the collar up also significantly widens the otherwise slim silhouette of her neck, giving it a sharp, dominant feel instead. I'm shaping the collar to try to show that it's actually wrapping around her neck as it fans out at the edges. From our point of view, it should appear symmetrical on either side of her body to avoid it looking warped. And then after that, my attention is back on the jacket itself, to have another crack at those folds and creases. The underlying anatomy of her body is helping me to make some sense of how the jacket should stretch across it, but the shape of its cut, material, and points of tension leave me feeling a little confused. If too many folds are placed around the wrong areas, they might not describe the fit of the jacket correctly. If they don't have the right thickness and density, then the jacket's material won't translate properly either. So without knowing what's going to work for sure here, I explore my options through good old-fashioned trial and error, lightly drawing in simple lines to indicate the composition, overlap, and direction of the clothing folds, and quickly erasing them if they look off to me so that I can start again. As a general rule, I know that the material is going to bunch up around the inner joints, and that we'll also see sharp creases around the points of tension from where the material will stretch out across the body, but it'll become more smooth around the peaks of the larger protruding forms that the material is firmly pressed against, such as the shoulders and breasts. In these areas, the less folds you have, the better. Oftentimes, a drawing is developed by figuring out what won't work so you can get closer to discovering what will. So tread softly, yes, but keep your pencil moving and give yourself permission to mess up as many times as you need to. No one gets a trophy for producing a drawing without having made any mistakes. The final presentation is all that matters, and if it takes you a few hiccups along the way to make it the best it can be, there's no shame in that. I rarely, in fact I never have a clean run from start to finish on an illustration. Reference helps a lot, especially when it comes to clothing, and I'm certainly using more than a few of them here to help me articulate her jacket. There is a number of considerations you'll want to take note of when it comes to drawing accurate clothing though. What the material is made of, whether it's leather, denim, cotton or fabric, the thickness, weight and density of that material, its cut, and how tight or loose it fits against the body. These attributes all play into where and how you place the folds of your character's clothing, and without putting some careful thought into it, you just won't know what to look for reference-wise, much less draw it in a convincing way. Next, I'm drawing in the outline for her legs. Even though most of the underlying muscle groups won't be defined in the final rendition, they are still providing an excellent guide for the outside contours to follow. What I'm really looking to capture here is a strong, vivid shape. You can see how the lines glide elegantly down the length of the leg as they delineate its anatomy, rhythmically curving inward and out along the hips, thighs and calves. This keeps the legs from looking stiff and lifeless, and more importantly, pushes their visual appeal. Time to tackle some tech. Again, the muscle structure of the forearm is used to help direct the design of her cybernetic enhancements, but of course I'm still building off of it. Notice how tiny my brush is. That's how I'm keeping the line work so fine to articulate those tiny details. There's not really any reference material being used for this part of the drawing, to be honest, because at this point I've already figured out my go-to tech aesthetics. So I'm just riffing with the pencil, trying to jot down something that looks cool. However, the tech design still has some anatomical grounding. That's what's providing my real source material here. Essentially, I'm just creating a second skin over the top of her arm. In fact, the very term for what I'm doing here is actually called skinning. So now I'm drawing in the outline of a gun. I'm not too sure about the details of its design just yet, but if I can at least establish the size and get a cool shape down for it to begin with, the ideas are going to start flowing. Sometimes you just have to draw anything down to coax out your creativity, and for me, the silhouette is often the easiest place to start. Now on a basic level, what we're looking at is a handgun, but in the context of the theme we're going for, it's a huge sci-fi laser blaster that looks more like a cross between a regular pistol and a sawn-off shotgun. And although there's a certain amount of creative liberty we can take here, it should still resemble and function like a real gun would. In other words, around the bare-bones barrel, handle and trigger that makes up the basic components of any firearm, we're coding it with the design elements that lend to that sci-fi theme. So I'm adding random details along the body of the gun, grooves and extrusions that form a technologically advanced looking shell around it. Of course, I've added dimension by presenting it in perspective with form and depth. This gives the gun solidity and avoids the common pitfall of drawing a flat, diagrammatic cutout instead. Design follows function, so as long as you keep the main mechanics of your subject intact, you can craft something totally unreal that still looks like it could work in reality. Almost everything is designed in this way. Even the character herself is built upon a skeleton that makes sense functionally. All the parts are still there, but they're heavily customized on the outside to create an interesting and unique design. The arms aren't the only cybernetically enhanced limbs on this character, she's also going to have robotic legs. Just as with the armoured leggings of our previous superheroine, I'm addressing the knees first. The joints have got to be designed in a way which conveys that the legs are capable of movement, and when you're talking about hard, rigid materials like metal, the mechanics of their construction do matter. I'm moulding the shape of the kneecap and segmenting the overlapping steel plates surrounding it to reflect the real anatomical structure of the leg, so the suggestion of motor functionality is tied into the augmented limb replacements by design. Having the anatomy already mapped out not only makes this process easy, it makes it fun too, because now we've got a blueprint for how the robotics should be built. So I'm really just tracing over the top of those underlying muscle groups to define the metal plating. What you might notice is the layers of steel that the character's legs are pieced together with comprise of shapes covering either large, medium, or small surface areas around the form. Those that are largest mostly outline the major muscle groups, and occupied within them are the secondary shapes that add visual interest. For example, the calves and tibial region at the front of the leg are covered by large sheets of metal, while the smaller elements, such as the rectangular bridge joins, ankle caps, and screws, complete the concept. Combined, these elements make up the shape language for the design of her robotic limbs, and it's important that they're distributed correctly to create a desirable composition. Here's the rule of thumb when it comes to establishing the individual shapes that make up your character's design. Medium surfaces should roughly occupy 1/3 of the space taken up by the largest, and distribution of the smallest elements should be equal to 1/3 of those that are medium. So to put it simply, major design elements are given the most room, while the sub-shapes and minor details are placed sparingly. This gives the concept greater clarity and makes it easier to read. You can imagine how visually disorientating your design might look if the opposite was true. It'd be the equivalent of an over-rendered flat illustration that lacks contrast and balance. In saying that, the scale used to define the size of these shapes can be adjusted as needed. After all, every design is different, so don't be too strict on yourself. The rule of thirds as it applies to shape language simply serves as a reliable guide that works well for most character concepts. Actually, for experienced artists, this comes intuitively anyway, even if they don't realize it. Now, if you're also creating a superheroine with cybernetic limbs or other technologically enhanced augmentations like this one, and you're stumped for ideas, I highly suggest jumping online and tracking down some references from your favorite sci-fi comic books, movies, and video games. Use the tech concepts created for those productions as inspiration for your own. In fact, if you're struggling to come up with an appealing shape language for your character, take the large, medium, and small design elements inside those references and combine them to form your own. What you'll probably find is that you're naturally predisposed to certain types of machinery and tech. Maybe you like the clean-cut look of an exoskeleton cloaked in an alloy shell, or the grunginess of a decommissioned mech. Whatever your specific tastes are, as you build upon them, you will develop a unique design aesthetic. Just don't rip them all from the one source. You don't want to steal your entire concept purely from another artist. At this point, I've formed a solid approach to designing tech that works for me. The line structure of the overlapping elements, the way they're shaped and detailed, are all based on the go-to patterns I've stored away inside my memory bank through repetition. Some of them were certainly extracted from references, others were discovered simply through experimentation. Not everything you try will work in a design, but the things that do, you'll tend to hang on to. Remember that to describe your characters with depth and dimension, each costume asset must follow the surface geometry of the body's basic forms. Notice how the straps of the gun holster aren't defined using straight lines. Instead, they curve around the cylindrical geometry of her upper thigh, helping to describe its shape. This is what causes your character to pop off of the page, and by transitioning into this three-dimensional mindset, you condition your brain to interpret the female figure as being made of solid, interlinked shapes that contain mass and volume. This is the main reason for using the mannequin model to establish the pose, placement, and proportions of your superheroines to begin with. It helps you to avoid the flat cutout effect many amateur artists are burdened with before they've properly grasped the fundamentals of form. Now, I haven't fleshed out a full backstory for the character just yet, but I'm thinking maybe her robotic enhancements are the result of some horrific incident that left her so physically destroyed, cybernetic augmentation was the only way to save her. Before that, maybe she was a highly trained operative who also happened to be the daughter of the CEO behind the world's most advanced law enforcement agency, which is why when her life was hanging in the balance, she was immediately nominated to become the agency's next robo-supercop. But then the plot thickens when we later find out that the hit on her was planned from the beginning, by the agency in fact, to turn one of their best law enforcers into an unstoppable, superpowered crime fighter. Question is, was her father aware of it? Look, I grew up in the 90s, and I can guarantee you that a good chunk of my imagination was shaped by movies like RoboCop, Terminator, and Blade Runner, not to mention all the cyborg superheroes, villains, and creatures that were headlining the comics of the Image era. In fact, Mark Silvestri's Cyberforce is still my main go-to series when I'm looking for some inspiration. At minimum, the 4 things you need to begin developing a compelling character design is a theme, archetype, trope, and spin. In this case, the theme would be cyberpunk, archetype, superheroine, trope, law enforcer, and her spin, cybernetically enhanced augmentations. These are the primary components that make a character feel relatable and familiar, yet new and unique, and once you determine what they are, you'll have all you need to direct their design. The full biography can come later, however, and oftentimes I find that the finished concept somewhat inspires it. The trick is to give yourself broader boundaries in the beginning to get the ball rolling, without confining yourself to the specifics of the design. Otherwise, the natural flow of your creativity will be stunted. So inevitably, the origin story for my superheroines will need a little more work, including this one. But what I've come up with so far for her design has already helped to at least form the synopsis. Plus, I've also struck upon a cool name for her, Glitch. I think it fits well with the sci-fi theme and somewhat lends toward those robotic enhancements. I'm going to start Glitch's fishnet stockings out with a series of diagonal parallel lines that wrap around the length of her upper leg. This particular type of hosiery is strongly associated with goth and punk styles of fashion, as well as being rather sexy, making the garment a welcome addition to her outfit. As I lay down the second layer of crosshatches, notice how once again the lines aren't rigidly ruled straight across the leg. Just like in real life, the skin-tight grid of diamond-shaped knitting defines the form by curving around it and accentuates the definition of her anatomy. Each line is kept extremely thin and drawn steadily to avoid any wobbliness. The spacing between them and the angle at which they're drawn at can be whatever you like, but it must be consistent. So if you're working digitally, it's a good idea to keep the second set of crosshatches on a separate layer. That way, if you mess up, you can simply erase the line in question without affecting the underlying hatches. Traditional artists, on the other hand, will have to be more careful because if you make a mistake, you might find that you have to attend to both layers of stitching in order to fix the netting of your character's stockings. Finally, I'm adding some texture to Glitch's hair and clarifying the shape of its style with a more defined outline. And that's it for the drafting stage of our superheroine character designs.